Hello, and welcome to the Mid-Ohio Valley Public Forum video podcast. I'm Jennifer Bryant.
And I'm Kim Van Ryn.
And we're your co-hosts. November 11th is Veterans Day, a day we set aside to honor those who have served our country in our armed forces. This year, we're honoring those that some refer to as the invisible vets. We call them invisible because their contribution to our military is so often forgotten about and overlooked.
So today we'll be interviewing several women vets from the local area from several different branches of the service.
First up is Dr. Gabriella Blyler Olson. Dr. Olson is an Air Force veteran. Welcome, Dr. Olson. We're delighted you could make yourself available to talk to us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I'll start off. When did you join the Air Force and how old were you?
I joined the Air Force in 1990. I was, 20, 21, 22. I was in college and getting ready to start medical school, and a recruiter came to one of our honoraries to tell us about a scholarship opportunity, and it was an Air Force scholarship. It was competitive. They only give out 200 nationwide, but if you got the scholarship, they basically paid for everything in medical school. So I could have graduated debt-free, which sounded like a really great idea when you consider the cost of 4 years of medical school. So I applied for the scholarship and I got one. And the deal was they paid for all 4 years of medical school, and then in return, you gave them 4 years on active duty.
Well, that sounds like that may answer our next question, which was why did you join the military? But there are usually more than one reason. What made you decide, was that the only reason that made you choose the Air Force, or was there another reason?
That was the primary reason I chose the Air Force. My grandfather was a veteran of World War II. He was in the Army. He was actually a prisoner of war. And so I had him as my inspiration, but I hadn't really thought about it or really even considered it until that recruiter showed up that day. And then I thought maybe this would be something that would make him proud and help me out with school loans.
So what were the things that came as the biggest shocks to you about when you served in the military? What were you not prepared for, or what surprised you?
Well, I wasn't prepared for how hard it is to lace up combat boots when you're 8 months pregnant, because I had my son when I was on active duty. At the time that I joined the military, it was in the early 90s. We were basically a nation, for the most part, at peace, other than some stuff in the Baltics and that kind of thing, and some stuff in the Middle East. But the recruiter basically said, you're probably not going to really get to go anywhere because we haven't really done anything in a long time that was big. And so I finished med school, and during med school, you're on reserve status. And then I went on active duty in 2000. And a year later was September 11th.
Mm-hmm. So describe your service. How long did you serve? What was your job? Where were you stationed? Did you get any awards? All that kind of stuff. Just tell us what it was like.
Okay. I served 3.5 years on reserve status. That was the time that I was in medical school. Before I started medical school, we had to do officers training because we were going to be on reserve status. And if something came up during that time, we needed to be trained. But through medical school, especially for the first 2 years, there's so much schoolwork. You can't really get away from that. And the military knows that. So all of my reserve time, instead of doing the 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year that most reserve military people do, with this program, they combined it all into 2 6-week rotations at a medical military facility. So that qualified for my reserve time, but still made it possible to finish school. And then once I graduated from medical school, I went on active duty after my residency. I did a family practice residency, which was a civilian residency. And then I went on active duty in 2000 to 2004 as a military family physician. Initially, I was stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which does not have an active flight line. It's the Center for the Materials Command, so it's where we ship things, but we don't necessarily ship people. And then after a couple of years there, I moved to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona, which has a very active flight line. That's our A-10 base, and A-10s provide close air support, and that's where I was stationed when I deployed for Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom.
Well, tell us your experience, how much of an issue it was being a woman in the military, either passively or maybe even institutionally during your service or even after.
As a physician in the military, I would say we had a fair representation of women in general in the medical corps, which is unusual. It's very different based on the field that you choose to go into in the military. Of course, women are now allowed in combat and women can be fighter pilots, but you tend to see women gravitate more towards a medical field. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with the training that you can get, that you can transition into the civilian world. So the medical corps had a pretty decent representation of women. But when I deployed, out of the 800 of us, on my deployment base, there were, I think, 24 women. So we were definitely underrepresented in the deployment world, but I was the only physician for all 800 of those people. And I had two technicians, one was male, one was female, and then our two biomedical engineers were both male. So within our little unit, we were 2/5 of the representation.
So how do you feel about having served? Do you regret it? Are you proud of your service? If you had the chance to go back and do it all over, would you do the same thing again?
We would. It was at times difficult. When I deployed, I had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old at home, with a husband left behind to take care of 2 children while he was working full time, and that was not easy. We had a lot of family members who pitched in and made it happen because I was gone for 5 months. I left in November, just before Thanksgiving, missed all the big holidays, and came back right before Easter. So I can't say that it was always easy, but I have a whole lot of life experience to draw on in my day-to-day job. I saw a whole lot of the world. Compliments of the United States military, sometimes from the window of a tanker or a KC-135, but I have been to a lot of places, and that's been really neat. I'd absolutely do it over again. Plus, there was the financial advantage of no med school loans. So, now I think I still have friends who are paying off their loans, 30 years later. So, that was a huge, huge thing.
It helps if I unmute.
I wondered what was going on.
My dog was barking, so I muted. What advice would you give to young women who are considering the military today?
I would absolutely urge young women to consider the military for several reasons. Life experience, training. There's certainly the financial advantage of things like the GI Bill if you want to go to college. Certainly if you're a woman who wants to enter a man's field, when you get out of the military, you can get great training for that in the military while still being treated as an equal. So I think it would be wonderful to have more women in the military. Actually, right now, the military has a fairly decent representation of women, but we can always use more.
I think we make up about 20% of the active duty forces right now. Yeah. So I think when I went in 74, it was more like 10%.
Yeah, it was probably about 14 when I first started. So we've made some gains.
Mm-hmm. So is there anything that you would like to tell us or our listeners about your service? Any funny anecdotes or unusual things that happened, or just anything we haven't touched on.
Oh gosh. There were certainly a lot of anecdotes and funny moments over that 7.5 years. But it was, it was really a good experience. I think, when something like September 11th happens, it really changes your perspective on things as an American. And to have been on active duty at that time and to have know that right at that very moment, your life is going to change and you don't know how, was a very sobering thought. But I think for women, you can get a lot of good experience and serve your country, have a source of pride. My children are 22, 19, and 15, and they still ask if I'm going to be home for Christmas because they remember that. So I think that, you learn a lot. Gosh, I'm going to get all choked up because it's Veterans Day. You learn a lot, but it's a great experience.
Well, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us this evening, and we thank you for your service. We'd like to tell our listeners to please take a moment and think about our veterans and remember that we owe a debt to all who have served to preserve our freedoms today and every day.
Thank you for honoring the women. We often do get forgotten, so.